The land west of the Missouri was a hard place, a testament to God's indifference. It was a country of brutal contrasts, where the sun could beat down from a merciless blue sky for months, cracking the earth into a mosaic of thirst, only to yield to skies the color of a bruise that would unleash torrents of freezing rain. The plains stretched into an eternity of waving grass that turned from green to gold to brown, and the deserts were vast, silent expanses of sand and rock, punctuated by skeletal cacti that reached for the heavens like the hands of the damned. Sparse forests of ponderosa pine clung to the hillsides, their scent a sharp, clean perfume in the thin air, but their shade was meager. And in the middle of it all were the towns, little more than collections of clapboard and grit, clinging to the edge of a railroad track or a muddy river. They were places like Harmony Creek, where the dust was a constant companion, settling on every hat brim, coating every throat, and rising in ghostly plumes with every footstep and horse hoof. This was a land that didn't forgive mistakes and offered no second chances. It demanded strength, resilience, and a quiet acceptance of the fact that survival was a victory in itself. In the heart of this unforgiving landscape, on a spread of land that was more stubbornness than soil, lived Eli Miller. He wasn't old, not by the calendar's count, but the man he was had died a year ago. The Eli who remained was a ghost, haunting the shell of a life he'd once tried to build. There was a time when his laughter could shake the rafters of the small cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, a time his shoulders seemed broad enough to carry the weight of the world. He had poured his sweat and blood into the ranch, believing in the promise of the West, the dream of a man making his own way. He'd had a wife then, Caroline, a woman with hair the color of corn silk and eyes as blue as the summer sky. She had shared his dream, or so he'd thought, until the dream soured. A bad winter took half their cattle, a dry summer withered their crops, and the debt mounted like a snowdrift in a blizzard. Caroline's pretty smiles curdled into tight lines of disappointment. One morning, he woke to find her gone, a short, cruel note left on the kitchen table. She'd left with a traveling merchant, a man with soft hands and a pocket full of coin, heading back east to a life of comfort she felt she deserved. Her leaving had broken something deep inside Eli. It wasn't just the love, it was the shame. She had left him because he had failed, because he was poor, in a land where a man's worth was measured by what he could tame and build. He had been found wanting, so he retreated into himself, into a fortress of silence. He worked from before dawn until after dusk, the repetitive motions of mending fences, tending to his few remaining cattle, and chopping wood becoming a form of penance. The life drained out of his eyes, leaving them the flat, gray color of a winter sky. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a rusty hinge that hadn't been used in months. He was a ghost on his own land, a man going through the motions of living long after his spirit had given up. The storm came on a Tuesday afternoon, rolling in from the north with a low, menacing growl. Eli had been on the roof of the barn, trying to patch a section of shingles that had been torn loose by the relentless wind. It was a fool's errand to be up there with the weather turning, but the leak was dripping onto his best hay, and he couldn't afford to lose any more than he already had. The sky darkened prematurely, the air growing thick and heavy. The first drops of rain were fat and cold, hitting the wooden shingles with a sound like pebbles being dropped. Then the wind hit, a sudden, violent gust that tore at his clothes and tried to rip the hammer from his hand. He pressed himself flat against the roof, waiting for it to pass. As he shifted his weight to get a better grip, his boot slipped on a patch of wet moss. For a moment, he hung in the air. A silent gasp caught in his throat. Then he fell. It wasn't a long drop, but he landed badly, his left leg twisting underneath him with a sickening crack that echoed louder than the rising thunder. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded behind his eyes. He cried out, a raw, animal sound that was swallowed by the storm. He tried to push himself up, but a wave of nausea and agony washed over him, and he collapsed back into the mud. The rain began in earnest now, a cold, driving deluge that soaked him to the bone in seconds. plastering his hair to his skull and turning the dusty ground around him into a thick, clinging mire. He lay there, helpless and exposed, as the world dissolved into a gray curtain of water and a symphony of thunder. He closed his eyes, a bitter resignation settling in his heart. This, he thought, was how it ended. Alone, broken in the mud, washed away by the very elements he had tried to conquer. He didn't know how long he lay there, minutes or an hour, drifting in and out of a haze of pain. He was only vaguely aware of a shape moving through the downpour, a figure cloaked in gray, seeming to materialize out of the storm itself. He thought it was a fever dream, an angel or a devil come to collect him. The figure knelt beside him, and a woman's voice cut through the roar of the rain, calm and clear. "Can you hear me, mister?" Eli forced his eyes open. A face swam into focus above him, framed by dark, wet hair that clung to her cheeks. She was young, her face pale and streaked with rain, but her eyes were a startling, steady brown, full of a strange and immediate concern. She wasn't an angel. She was real. Her name, he would learn later, was June. She appeared at his ranch like a piece of driftwood washed ashore by the storm. She explained, in a voice that was soft but held no hint of weakness, that she was, or had been, a mail-order bride. Her intended, a farmer in Harmony Creek, had taken one look at her stepping off the stagecoach, declared she wasn't what he'd pictured, and had turned his back on her without another word. Stranded, with only a few dollars to her name and a single suitcase. She had started walking, hoping to find work or shelter in the next town over, before the storm had caught her on the open road. She had seen his ranch, a faint smudge of civilization against the darkening horizon, and had sought refuge. Instead, she had found him. Eli? His mind clouded by pain but sharp with gratitude. Did the only thing he couldn't send her back out into the storm, not after she had saved his life. With remarkable strength and resourcefulness, she had managed to drag him out of the mud and into the relative dryness of the barn, splinting his shattered leg with a piece of fence post and his own leather belt. When he offered her shelter, it wasn't out of charity, but out of a profound sense of debt. "You can stay," he'd gritted out through clenched teeth, till you're on your feet, and I am." The first few days were a study in silence. They were two strangers bound together by circumstance, two wounded souls occupying the same small space, and the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken words and cautious movements. June was a quiet presence. She moved about the cabin with an economy of motion, tending to his leg, cooking simple meals from his meager pantry, and keeping the fire fed. Eli watched her from his cot, his gaze following her as she swept the floor or mended a tear in one of his shirts. He noticed the small things, the way she'd bite her lip when she was concentrating, the weary slump of her shoulders when she thought he wasn't looking, the innate competence in her hands. They existed in separate orbits that occasionally, accidentally, brushed against each other. A fleeting touch of fingers as she handed him a cup of water. A shared glance across the room that was held for a second too long. The quiet sound of their breathing in the stillness of the night. In that shared silence, something began to shift. The cabin, which had been Eli's tomb of loneliness, began to feel less empty. Her presence was a quiet hum of life that slowly, imperceptibly, began to push back against the ghost that haunted him. The cold snap hit a week after his accident. The temperature plummeted, and a biting wind howled around the corners of the cabin, seeking out every crack and crevice. That night, they sat before the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. It was the first time they had sat together not as patient and nurse, but simply as two people seeking warmth. For a long while, they said nothing, watching the flames lick and curl around the logs. Then, Eli spoke, his voice rough from disuse. The words were dragged from him like stones from a deep well. He told her about Caroline. He didn't dress it up with sentiment or rage. He just laid the facts bare. The promises, the hardship, the betrayal. He spoke of the silence she had left behind, a silence that had grown until it had filled every corner of his life. When he finished, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. June didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. She simply listened, her gaze fixed on the flames. Then, in a voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear it, she told him her own story. She spoke of a life of being overlooked, of being seen not as a person, but as a commodity, a daughter to be married off, a bride to be accepted or rejected on a whim. Her tale was not of a single, sharp betrayal like his, but of 1,000 small dismissals, a lifetime of being told she was not enough. As they shared their broken pieces in the warm glow of the fire, a profound and unexpected connection was forged between them. They were two different people, from two different pasts, but their pain spoke the same language. They were both survivors of a world that had cast them aside. In the quiet darkness of that small cabin, surrounded by the vast and indifferent wilderness of the West, Eli Miller and the stranger named June found a fragile, flickering ember of comfort in each other's company. It was not a cure for their loneliness, but for the first time in a long time, for both of them, it felt like a reprieve. The passing weeks were measured not in days on a calendar, but in the slow, steady mending of bone and spirit under June's care. Eli began to feel like a man again, not just the ghost of one. The pain in his leg receded from a raging fire to a dull, manageable ache, and he graduated from his cot to a crutch he fashioned from a sturdy oak branch. But the deeper healing was the one he hadn't known he needed. June's quiet, constant presence was a balm to the raw wound Caroline had left behind. She had a way about her, a natural competence that transformed the dusty, neglected cabin into a home. She didn't fill the space with chatter, but with life. The scent of baking bread replaced the stale smell of loneliness. His worn-out shirts were patched with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned the rhythms of the ranch with an instinct that amazed him, knowing when to bring him a cool drink of water as he sat mending tack, how to calm a spooked calf, and how to make a hearty stew from little more than potatoes, onions, and a bit of dried beef. She worked not as a guest, but as a partner. There were evenings he would watch her by the firelight, her hands busy with some task, and a feeling would rise in his chest so powerful it almost frightened him. She was, in every way that mattered, what a wife was supposed to be, steadfast, capable, and kind. This change did not go unnoticed. The West was a place of vast distances, but news traveled faster than a prairie fire on the wind. When Eli finally hobbled into Harmony Creek for supplies, leaning heavily on his crutch, the questions began. Old Man Hemlock, the proprietor of the general store, peered at him over his spectacles. "Heard you had a bad fall, Eli, and that you've got yourself some help out at the ranch." The word help was loaded, heavy with insinuation. Eli saw the women of the town whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting from him to the extra flour and sugar he was buying. A man living alone with a woman who wasn't his kin or his wife. It was a scandal, a violation of the unwritten code of decency that held these small, isolated communities together. At first, the gossip stung Eli's pride. He had always been a private man, and he felt their judgment like a physical weight. He considered telling June it was time for her to move on, to preserve both their reputations. But the thought of the cabin falling silent again, of waking to that oppressive emptiness, was more than he could bear. He looked at the townsfolk, at their narrow, pinched faces, and made a decision. Let them talk. Their whispers were a small price to pay for the light June had brought back into his life. He he needed to keep her with him. So he held his head high, paid for his supplies, and rode out of town. A silent act of defiance that declared his ranch his own kingdom, with its own rules. The storms in that country didn't just bring rain. They brought a change in the air, a raw electric energy that seemed to stir something primal in the blood. Another one rolled in a week later, a real gully washer that turned the twilight into an early, tumultuous night. A clap of thunder startled the horses, and Eli, now able to walk with a slight limp, went with June to the barn to settle them. The rain hammered on the roof, a deafening drumbeat that shut out the rest of the world, enclosing them in the warm, earthy darkness, with the scent of hay and damp leather and animals. He watched her as she moved from stall to stall, murmuring softly to the nervous horses, her hand a reassuring presence on their powerful necks. The lantern cast a golden glow on her, making her dark, damp hair shine and throwing her shadow, long and graceful, against the rough-hewn wood of the barn wall. The storm raged outside, but inside this small space, there was a profound peace. And in that peace, an undeniable tension began to build. A current that had been flowing beneath the surface of their quiet days, now pulled to the forefront by the intimacy of the storm. She finished with the last horse and turned, her eyes finding his in the flickering light. A strand of wet hair had fallen across her cheek, and without thinking, he reached out and gently brushed it away. His fingers lingered on her skin for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The air crackled. The distance they had so carefully maintained, the polite fiction of patient and nurse, dissolved in that single touch. He saw a question in her eyes, a silent, vulnerable query that mirrored the one pounding in his own heart. He took a step closer, and then another. He didn't know who moved first, or if they both moved at the same time, but suddenly she was in his arms. He held her close, burying his face in her damp hair, inhaling her scent of rain and wood smoke. It was an embrace born of weeks of unspoken gratitude, of shared loneliness, of a desperate, burgeoning hope. It was a solid, living warmth against the cold that had lived inside him for so long. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his chest. Or maybe it was his own. A roll of thunder shook the very foundations of the barn, a deep, resonant growl from the heavens. He tilted her chin up, his thumb stroking her jawline. Her eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted. The desire that had been simmering for weeks, a slow, quiet heat, now flared into a consuming fire. He had been starved for so long, not just for the touch of a woman, but for the touch of this woman. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was hungry, desperate, a release of all the pent-up loneliness and longing that had defined his existence. It was the kiss of a drowning man finally breaking the surface for air. And she met him with an equal, surprising fervor, her arms tightening around his neck, her body pressing into his. It was a kiss that spoke of things they had never said aloud, of gratitude turning into affection, affection into need. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the scent of hay and rain, they crossed a line from which there was no return. It wasn't a moment of weakness or sin. For Eli, it felt like a homecoming, a reclamation of the man he was supposed to be. For both of them, in that raw and honest collision of two lonely souls, it felt less like a fall from grace and more like a moment of profound, desperate salvation. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. When Eli woke, the first pale light of morning was filtering through the cabin window. June was already awake, sitting in a chair by the hearth, wrapped in a blanket. She was watching him, her expression unreadable in the gray light. He smiled, a slow, contented smile that reached his eyes for the first time in over a year. But as he looked at her, he saw the shadow in her gaze, the one he had occasionally glimpsed but never understood. It was there now, deeper and more pronounced. He watched as her lips moved, forming a silent word he couldn't hear. Then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, not meant for him but for the quiet morning air. "I'm sorry." The words were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Sorry for what? For the passion and tenderness they had shared. It made no sense, but before he could ask, she turned to him, and the shadow was gone, replaced by a soft, hesitant smile. The moment passed, but it left an unsettling echo in the back of his mind. There was something she was holding back, a piece of her story she hadn't shared by the fire that night. A month passed. The splint came off Eli's leg, leaving him with a permanent limp that was a small price to pay for his life. He and June settled into a new rhythm, a domesticity that was as comfortable and natural as breathing. They were man and wife in all but name, their bond forged not by a preacher's words but by a shared storm and a quiet understanding. The ranch, once Eli's prison, was now their sanctuary. But every now and then, when June thought he wasn't looking, Eli would see that shadow in her eyes again, a fleeting glimpse of a secret she carried, as silent and heavy as a stone. The world, for a time, had shrunk to the boundaries of the ranch, and within those boundaries, Eli had found a fragile peace. The rhythms of his life with June were as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. He'd wake to the smell of coffee and bacon, work his land with a renewed sense of purpose, and end his days by the fire. Not in silence, but in a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the soft sounds of June mending or the shared reading of a worn-out dime novel. The ghost that had haunted him had receded, replaced by a man who was beginning to believe he might deserve a second chance at happiness. The limp in his leg was a constant reminder of the day she arrived, a reminder of how close he'd come to the end, and how she had pulled him back. It was a late afternoon in the high summer, the sun a molten gold in a cloudless sky. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood tree by the cabin, carrying the scent of dust and wild sage. Eli was reinforcing a corral fence, the rhythmic thud of his hammer a steady punctuation to the lazy hum of insects. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow and looked toward the small garden June had cultivated near the cabin. She was there, kneeling in the rich soil, a simple bonnet shielding her face from the sun. She looked up, as if sensing his gaze, and gave him a small, genuine smile. In that simple, wordless exchange, a universe of contentment existed. The world was right. The past was a scar, but it had finally begun to heal. That was when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It was out of place. The mail rider had already passed, and it was too early for any of the hands from the neighboring ranches to be heading home. He watched as the cloud grew larger, resolving itself into a dark shape that glinted in the sun. A carriage, not a buckboard or a farm wagon, but a proper enclosed carriage, drawn by two tired-looking horses. Such vehicles were a rarity out here, a sign of money or trouble, and often both. A knot of unease tightened in Eli's gut. He laid his hammer down and walked slowly toward the gate, his limp more pronounced with his sudden tension. The carriage pulled to a halt, the horses heaving, their flanks slick with sweat. The door opened with a tired creak, and a woman stepped out. For a moment, Eli's mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. The woman was thinner than he remembered, and the fine dress she wore was travel-stained and frayed at the hem. The corn silk hair was duller, pulled back in a severe bun, and the eyes that were as blue as a summer sky now held a desperate, calculating light. But it was her. It was Caroline. Before he could find his voice, she moved aside, revealing two small children who had been hiding behind her skirts, a boy and a girl, with identical towheads and wide, wary eyes. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old. They clung to their mother's dress, two small, silent anchors in a world that had clearly been unkind to them. "Eli," Caroline said, her voice a strange mixture of practiced humility and brittle pride. I had nowhere else to go." The world tilted on its axis. Eli felt the air leave his lungs, as if he'd been kicked by a mule. The scar tissue over his heart ripped open, and the old pain, the raw, bitter shame of her betrayal, poured through him like poison. He could only stare, his mind a maelstrom of shock and disbelief. She launched into her story, the words tumbling out in a rushed, self-pitying torrent. The merchant she'd left him for had promised her the world, but his fortunes had turned. He'd lost everything in a bad investment, grown cruel and resentful, and had finally cast her out, leaving her with nothing but the children and a handful of dollars. "He's not a good man, Eli," she said, tears welling in her eyes. Tears that Eli suspected were more for her own misfortune than for any real remorse. "I was a fool, a blind, foolish girl. I never should have left. This is my home. You are my husband. I'm asking you to take us in, to take back your family." The word family hit him like a physical blow. He looked from her hardened, desperate face to the two small, frightened children. His gaze was snagged by the boy, who peered up at him with a look of solemn curiosity. There was something in the shape of the boy's eyes, a flicker of defiance, that was unnervingly familiar. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. It was June, drawn from her garden by the strange arrival. She stood frozen by the corner of the cabin, her hands covered in dirt, her face a mask of confusion. Who is that?" she asked softly as she drew closer. Before Eli could answer, Caroline's sharp gaze landed on June. A flicker of contempt crossed her features. "And who is this?" she demanded, her voice dripping with disdain. "The new help." "Her name is June," Eli said, his voice flat and hard. "She's staying here." "This is Caroline," he said to June, the name feeling like ash in his mouth. "My wife." The effect of that name on June was immediate and devastating. The color drained from her face, leaving it a sickly white. Her eyes widened, not just with the shock of a rival's appearance, but with something else, a deep, panicked recognition. It was as if the name Caroline itself was a ghost she had long been running from. She took a half-step back, her hands trembling slightly. Without a word, she turned and fled into the cabin, the screen door slamming shut behind her with a sound that echoed the closing of a door in Eli's own heart. The rest of the day passed in a surreal, suffocating haze. Eli, paralyzed by a mixture of rage, pity, and a profound sense of duty he didn't want, allowed Caroline and the children into the cabin. He couldn't turn them away. He couldn't leave two small children to the mercy of the wilderness. No matter how much he despised their mother, the cabin, which had become a sanctuary of peace for two, was now a crowded, tense prison for four. Caroline tried to fill the silence with talk of her hardships, but Eli didn't listen. June remained locked in the small spare room, a silent, barricaded presence. That night, after Caroline and the exhausted children had fallen asleep in his own bed, he would sleep in the barn. Eli went to June's door. The silence from within was absolute. "June?" he whispered, his hand resting on the rough wood. "Talk to me." There was no answer. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "Don't shut me out. Not now." He heard a faint rustle, and then her voice came, muffled by the door. It was a voice he barely recognized, stripped of all its warmth, all its kindness. It was the voice of a stranger, cold and distant as a star. "There's nothing to talk about," she said. "Nothing to talk about," he repeated, his disbelief turning to anger. "Caroline shows up on our doorstep and you have nothing to say? What we've built here, does it mean nothing?" "What we have," she replied, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, "was a temporary arrangement. I was a stray you took in. You were a man who needed help. The debt is paid." Each word was a nail in the coffin of the life he thought they were building. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't the June who had nursed him, who had laughed with him, who had met his passion with her own. "That's not true, and you know it," he said, his voice rising. Then came the final, killing blow. "I was just a passerby. Eli," she said, her voice chillingly calm. "You have a family now. Your wife and your children are here. That is where you belong." He stood there in the dark hallway, stunned into silence. He felt a rage building in his chest, a hot, bitter fury unlike anything he had ever known. It wasn't just directed at Caroline for her selfish, destructive return. It was aimed at June, at this stranger behind the door who had, with a few cold words, dismissed everything that had passed between them. He felt a profound and devastating sense of betrayal, a wound deeper and more complex than the one Caroline had first inflicted. She had betrayed his past, a past he was trying to forget, but June had just betrayed his future. He was trapped between two women, two promises, two different kinds of pain, and in that moment, utterly and completely alone. Eli felt as though he had been betrayed by them both. The days that followed were suffocating. The small cabin, once a haven, became a pressure cooker of unspoken resentments and cloying silence. Caroline moved through the space with a proprietary air, trying to reclaim a life she had willingly abandoned. She was a ghost of a different sort than the one Eli had been, a ghost of a past he wanted to keep buried. She tried to bridge the chasm between them with small, calculated gestures. She cooked his meals, humming old tunes they once shared, but the food tasted like ashes in his mouth. She wore a faded blue dress of hers that he'd once loved, but now the sight of it only reminded him of her deceit. One evening, as he sat staring into the fire, she came up behind him and laid a hand on his shoulder. He flinched as if he'd been burned, a sharp, involuntary recoil that was more damning than any angry words. He stood up and walked out without looking at her, leaving her standing alone in the flickering firelight, her hand still hovering in the empty air. His coldness was a wall she could not breach. He gave her nothing. No anger, no forgiveness, just a vast, empty indifference. He spoke to her only when necessary. His words clipped and functional, concerning supplies or the children. All the emotion he withheld from her, he found himself directing, to his own surprise, toward the two small strangers in his house. The twins, Samuel and Sarah, were quiet and watchful, their young lives already shaped by upheaval and uncertainty. In them, Eli saw none of Caroline's calculating nature. They were simply children, innocent and lost. He found himself observing them, drawn by a force he didn't understand. He watched them play in the dust by the porch, their small hands building forts and then knocking them down with gleeful shouts. He saw the way Samuel would purse his lips in concentration when trying to tie his own shoe, and the way Sarah would tilt her head, a stubborn frown on her face. When she was told she couldn't do something, there was a spark in their eyes, a bright, mischievous intelligence that stirred a long, dormant memory in him. It was the same look his own mother had told him that he used to have as a boy, right before he got into some kind of trouble. This flicker of familiarity was both comforting and deeply unsettling. He felt a connection to them, a strange, protective instinct that was entirely separate from their mother. One night, the dam of his carefully constructed indifference finally broke. A fever had taken hold of Sarah, and her fretful cries echoed through the small cabin. Caroline, exhausted and impatient, was struggling to soothe her. Eli, unable to bear the sound of the child's distress, took over. He lifted the small, hot body from the cradle and held her against his chest, walking the floorboards in slow, steady circuits, humming a low, tuneless song his own father used to hum to him. After a long while, her cries subsided into ragged breaths, and she finally drifted into a restless sleep, her small head nestled in the crook of his neck, as he stood there in the quiet dark, the only light coming from the moon through the window. He felt a profound and unfamiliar wave of tenderness wash over him. He gently brushed a damp curl of hair from her forehead, his rough finger tracing the delicate line of her ear. And that's when he felt it, a small, raised bump of skin, just behind her earlobe. Curiosity piqued. He angled her head slightly toward the moonlight. It was a birthmark, no bigger than a lentil, shaped almost like a tiny crescent moon. It was nothing, a simple quirk of skin, but a sudden, insistent memory made him cross the room to where Samuel slept soundly in a small trundle bed. With a hand that trembled slightly, he gently pushed aside the boy's blonde hair and looked. There, in the exact same spot behind the boy's left ear, was the identical mark, a tiny, perfect crescent moon. A cold dread snaked its way up his spine. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He turned and walked to the small, cracked mirror that hung by the door. His hand went to his own left ear, his fingers searching for something he hadn't thought about in years. And there it was, a familiar, small bump of skin, the same shape, the same place, a birthmark his mother had called his own personal moon, a mark his father had and his grandfather before him. The room seemed to spin. It was impossible. A coincidence. But it wasn't. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that it was not a coincidence. The implications were too vast, too monstrous for his mind to grasp. He stumbled back from the mirror, his breath catching in his throat. A single, terrifying question screaming in the silence of his mind. Suddenly, he needed June. He needed her calm, her quiet strength, the steady look in her eyes that had always seemed to hold the truth. He turned and strode to the spare room, his confusion and fear momentarily eclipsing the anger he'd felt toward her. He knocked on the door, harder than he intended. "June?" Silence. He knocked again. "June, open the door. I need to talk to you." When only the sound of the wind answered him, a new, sharper fear took hold. He twisted the knob. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the small space scrubbed clean, as if she had never been there at all. But on the pillow, a single folded piece of paper caught the moonlight. His hands shook as he picked it up. The handwriting was hers, neat, precise, but with a slight tremor in the strokes. It was short, the words stark against the cheap paper. Asterisk Eli, asterisk, asterisk. Do not look for me. I am not worthy of it. What I have done is unforgivable. You deserve to know the truth, but I do not have the courage to tell you. Please, for your own sake, forget you ever knew me. Asterisk June, asterisk. He read it once, then twice, the words burning themselves into his mind. I am not worthy. The truth. The sentences were a confession and a riddle all at once. They explained nothing, and yet, somehow, they explained everything. Her sudden coldness, her panicked flight, it wasn't a betrayal of him. It was a flight from something else, from a truth she couldn't face. The fury he had felt toward her evaporated, replaced by a desperate, all-consuming need for answers. The mystery of the birthmarks and the mystery of June's letters slammed together in his mind, creating a singular obsession. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that they were connected. He did not sleep that night. By dawn, he was a man transformed. The listless, angry stupor was gone, replaced by a cold, hard purpose. He packed a small satchel with dried beef, a canteen, and the few dollars he had. He checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded. Caroline watched him, her eyes wide with alarm. Eli, where are you going? I'm going to find her, he said, his voice a low growl. He didn't look at her or the children. He was looking past them, at a truth that lay somewhere out in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. His search began in Harmony Creek. He went first to the general store, but Mr. Hemlock had seen nothing. A lone woman sets off. She could be heading anywhere, Eli or nowhere. The words were meant to be discouraging, but they only hardened Eli's resolve. He went to the livery. The stable owner remembered her. She'd asked about the schedule for the eastbound stage, but she hadn't bought a ticket, a dead end. He spent the afternoon at the post office, speaking with the clerk, a fussy little man named Silas. Had June received any mail, sent any? Silas, bound by his professional duty, was reluctant to say, but Eli's gaze was hard, and his quiet desperation was more intimidating than any threat. Finally, Silas relented and checked his logs. No mail sent or received under the name June, another dead end. Frustrated, Eli was about to leave when an idea struck him. He thought about the ledger's Mr. Hemlock kept for store credit. It was a long shot. He went back to the general store and asked to see the transaction logs for the past year. Hemlock grumbled, but eventually complied. Eli spent hours poring over the faded ink, his finger tracing a line after line of mundane purchases. And then he found it. Not under June's name, under the name of the farmer who had jilted her. 6 months prior, a record of a telegraph sent, with the cost paid in cash. The destination was a small town near the border, a place called Providence. It was a slim thread, a wild guess. But it was the only thing he had. He left the store, his course now set. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a hunter, and he was hunting for the truth. The journey to Providence was a descent into a harsher, more desolate landscape. The further south he rode, the sparser the ponderosa pines became, giving way to scrubland and cracked, sun-baked earth. The sky was a vast, indifferent bowl of blue, and the sun was a relentless hammer. The land was a reflection of his own soul, stripped bare, parched, and burning with a singular, obsessive heat. The thread he followed, a 5-year-old telegraph message, was so thin it was almost imaginary, but he clung to it with the desperation of a man who had nothing else. He rode hard, sleeping little. The words of June's letter and the image of the crescent moon birthmarks a constant, looping torment in his mind. Providence was less a town and more a collection of buildings clinging to the edge of nothing. It was a place for men on the run, a final stop before the border, smelling of cheap whiskey, dust, and regret. It was the kind of place where people didn't ask questions, where secrets could be buried deep. Eli started his search not by asking for June, but by looking for a woman who ran a boarding house, someone who might have rented a room to a lone woman 5 years ago. He moved from one ramshackle establishment to another. His inquiries met with suspicious stares and gruff dismissals. His luck turned at a small, weathered house at the edge of town, the paint peeling in long strips like sunburnt skin. The woman who answered the door was a widow named Martha Gable, her face a roadmap of hard years. But her eyes were sharp and clear. When Eli described the woman he was looking for, young, quiet, dark hair, likely traveling alone, a flicker of recognition crossed Mrs. Gable's face. "I remember a girl like that," she said, her voice raspy. "Came here near 5 years back, name of Abbott, June Abbott, kept to herself mostly, a good, hard-working girl, paid her rent on time." She paused, her gaze shrewd. "Why are you looking for her?" "It's a personal matter," Eli said, his voice tight. "A family matter." "Mrs.?" Gable studied him for a long moment, then seemed to reach a decision. "She was with child when she came to me," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Tried to hide it, but a woman knows these things. She stayed until the babies were born. Twins, a boy and a girl." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. Twins. He thought of Samuel and Sarah, of their wide, watchful eyes. He didn't know what he had assumed, that they were the children of the merchant Caroline had run off with. But the timing. Caroline had been gone less than a year when she returned. The twins were 4 years old. A cold, sickening realization began to dawn in the pit of his stomach. "The babies," he started, his throat suddenly dry. "What happened to them?" "She left with them," Mrs. Gable said. "Couldn't stay here. No work for a woman with 2 infants. Last I heard, she was trying to find a place up north. Said she had to set things right." Eli's mind was reeling, struggling to piece together a puzzle whose shape was becoming more monstrous with every new piece. June, the mother of the twins. It seemed impossible. Yet it explained her terrified reaction to Caroline, her panicked flight. He had to know for sure. "Is there a record, a birth certificate?" Mrs. Gable nodded toward the center of the dusty town. "Doc Adams delivered them. He's long dead now, but the town clerk keeps all the official papers in the courthouse. If you're family, he might show you." The clerk was a weasel of a man with a thin mustache and suspicious eyes, but a silver dollar placed firmly on the dusty counter loosened his sense of civic duty. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a large, leather-bound ledger. He thumbed through the brittle pages, the silence in the small. Hot office broken only by the rustle of paper and the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. "Here we are," the clerk said, his finger landing on an entry. 2 births, a boy and a girl, born to one June Abbott. Eli leaned over the counter, his heart pounding a deafening rhythm against his ribs. The ink was faded, the handwriting a graceful, looping script. He saw the names, Samuel Abbott and Sarah Abbott. He saw the date of birth, confirming their age. He scanned the entry, his eyes searching for the one crucial piece of information. And then he saw it, on the line designated for the father's name, written in the same steady hand, were 2 words that shattered his world. Eli Miller. He stared at the name, his own name, and the world fell away. The buzzing of the fly, the smell of dust and old paper, the clerk's impatient tapping, it all vanished. There was only the name on the page, a stark and undeniable truth. The birthmarks, her letter. "You deserve to know the truth." It wasn't a coincidence. They were his, the children living under his roof. The children of the woman who had betrayed him were not her children at all. They were his, and they were June's. He stumbled back from the counter, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. He leaned against the wall, the rough plaster grounding him as his mind spun. How? When? He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the pieces together, and a memory, fragmented and shrouded in the fog of whiskey and grief, began to surface. The world dissolved and reformed. 5 years earlier, he was back at the ranch, but it was a different place. Caroline was still there, her presence a constant, low-grade source of tension. She complained about the dust, the loneliness, the hard work. He remembered a hired girl, a quiet, almost invisible figure who moved through the house like a shadow. He couldn't recall her face clearly, only an impression of downcast eyes and quiet efficiency. Her name was June Abbott. He remembered a day, one of the countless days of tension with Caroline, when he'd come across one of the ranch hands, a brutish man thick with liquor, backing the hired girl into a corner of the barn. He remembered the fear in her eyes, the man's leering grin. Eli hadn't thought. He had just acted. He'd grabbed the man by the collar and thrown him into a hay bale, his voice a low, dangerous command to leave her be. The man had scrambled away, and Eli had turned to the girl. "You all right?" he'd asked. She had just nodded, unable to speak, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something he hadn't recognized then, but saw now with devastating clarity. Adoration. For him. It had been a fleeting moment, an instinctual act of protection. For her, it had been something more. The memory sharpened, focusing on the worst night of his life. The night he found Caroline's note. The world had ended. The shame, the failure, the utter desolation had consumed him. He had taken a bottle of whiskey to the porch and had proceeded to drink himself into oblivion, seeking a darkness that could match the one inside him. He remembered weeping. Raw, ragged sobs of a man whose foundations had been ripped out from under him. And he remembered a presence, a hand on his shoulder, a quiet voice murmuring words of comfort he couldn't understand. It was the hired girl, June. She had brought him a blanket against the night chill, had taken the bottle from his unresisting hand. He had been a mess of self-pity and drunken despair, and she had simply been there, a beacon of simple, human kindness in his storm of grief. The rest was a blur, a collection of shameful, hazy images, her helping him inside, the smell of her hair, clean and fresh, the warmth of her hand in his. A moment of desperate, unthinking connection, not of passion or lust, but of 2 lonely, broken people colliding in the dark. A moment where his overwhelming need for comfort had met her silent, long-held affection. He had woken the next morning with a pounding head and a vague, sick feeling of shame, to find the cabin empty. He'd seen a note on the table saying she'd had to leave for a family emergency, her wages left untouched. He had been relieved, eager to erase the fuzzy, uncomfortable memory of his own weakness. He had never thought of her again. Until now. Eli opened his eyes. He was back in the clerk's office in Providence, the dusty ledger still open on the counter. The truth was laid bare, and it was more terrible and more tragic than anything he could have imagined. June hadn't betrayed him. She had protected him. She had carried his children, had borne them alone, and had kept his secret, a secret he hadn't even known existed. The shame he felt now was 1,000 times sharper than the shame of Caroline's departure. It was the shame of a man who had been blind, who had failed to see the quiet devotion of one woman and had been utterly deceived by the calculated lies of another. His quest was no longer a search for answers. It was a hunt for redemption. He had to find her. He had to find the mother of his children. The ride back from Providence was a blur of dust and fury. The horse, sensing the desperate urgency in its rider, ate up the miles, its hooves a frantic drumbeat against the hard-packed earth. Eli didn't notice the searing sun or the biting wind. He was consumed by a fire within, a white-hot rage fed by 5 years of lies. Every rock, every twisted tree seemed to mock him, silent witnesses to a truth he had been too blind to see. He was a man riding through the ruins of his own life, and he had a singular, terrible purpose: to face the architect of that ruin. He arrived at the ranch as the sun was bleeding across the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows from the corrals. Caroline was on the porch, rocking in a chair, a picture of domestic tranquility that was so false it made his stomach turn. She looked up as he dismounted, a relieved smile starting to form on her lips. The smile died when she saw his face. It was a mask of cold, controlled fury, his eyes as hard and gray as granite. He didn't greet her. He strode onto the porch and stopped before her, his presence a dark, menacing storm. "Where is the letter, Caroline?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Letter? Eli, what are you talking about? You look half dead." She started to rise, to feign concern, but his gaze pinned her to the chair. "The letter," he repeated, the words like chips of ice. "The one June wrote to me 5 years ago. The one telling me she was carrying my children." Every trace of color drained from her face, her composure, the carefully constructed facade of the wronged woman, shattered into 1,000 pieces. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," he snarled, his voice finally breaking its restraint. "Not anymore. I've been to Providence. I've seen the birth records. I know they're mine." He took a step closer, towering over her. "I know everything." Her denial crumbled into a sniveling defense. "She was nothing, a hired girl. She was trying to trap you, to take what was mine." And then, the whole venomous truth spilled out of her. She told him everything, her words a torrent of jealousy and spite. She had been packing her own things, preparing to leave him for the promise of an easier life. When she found the half-finished letter on the small table in June's room, the simple, heartfelt words, confessing June's love and the child she carried, had been a spark to Caroline's deep-seated resentment. It wasn't that she wanted Eli, but she couldn't stand the thought of him finding happiness with someone else, especially not with the quiet, unassuming girl she had always looked down upon. She had confronted June, the letter clutched in her hand like a weapon. She had accused her of being a scheming harlot, had threatened to ruin her, to tell Eli that June had been with other men and was trying to pass off another's child as his. She gave the frightened, isolated girl an ultimatum: disappear and never contact Eli again, or she would destroy her reputation and ensure that Eli would hate her forever. June, young, alone, and terrified of causing the man she loved more pain, had agreed. She had packed her single bag and vanished into the night, leaving Caroline to burn the letter and complete her own betrayal. Eli listened, his rage cooling into a profound, chilling disgust. He looked at this woman, the mother of none of his children, and felt nothing but a vast, empty contempt. He had been a fool, twice over, once for believing her love, and once for being blind to her cruelty. "The world is full of liars," he said, his voice now utterly devoid of emotion. "But you, Caroline, you are the worst kind. You build your life on the ruins of other people's." He pointed toward the road. "Get your things, take the children's things. Be gone by morning." "Eli, you can't," she cried, a new panic in her eyes. "Where will I go? What will I do?" "That is no longer my concern," he said, turning his back on her. "You have a talent for survival. I suggest you use it." He spent that night in the barn, the confrontation leaving him hollowed out and raw. The great, consuming anger had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold ashes of grief. The world he had thought he understood had been a lie, crafted by a hateful woman and enabled by his own blindness. But as he sat in the darkness, the smell of hay and leather around him, one question continued to plague him, a question that Caroline's confession hadn't answered. Asterisk. Why did June stay silent? Why hadn't she tried to reach him again after she was clear of Caroline's influence? Fear, pride, or did she believe he wouldn't have wanted her? Or the children? The thought was a knife in his gut. He had to know her reasons, had to hear them from her own lips. The next day, after watching Caroline's wagon disappear down the road in a cloud of dust, he set about his task with a grim determination. He left the twins in the care of a neighbor, a kind woman who asked no questions, promising to return. He went back to town, but this time his questions were different. He was no longer looking for a woman named June Abbott. He was asking about a young mother with twin babies who had passed through the area 4 years ago. For days, he found nothing. Then, in a saloon, he met a grizzled old trapper who spent his seasons in the high, rugged country of the Granite Mountains. The man's eyes lit with a flicker of recognition. He told a story of a rumor he'd heard up in the passes, of a reclusive young woman. Some said a widow, who lived alone in a hidden valley with 2 small children. No one knew her name or where she'd come from. They only knew she was fiercely protective and kept to herself. It was a whisper, a ghost of a lead. But to Eli, it was a gospel. The Granite Mountains were a brutal, unforgiving wilderness, a place where people went to disappear. He bought supplies, saddled his most sure-footed horse, and rode north, toward the jagged peaks that tore at the sky like the teeth of some great stone beast. The journey was a descent into hell. The foothills were a maze of dense, dark forests where the sun barely pierced the canopy, and every rustle in the undergrowth sounded like a threat. He crossed the Black River, a churning torrent of snowmelt so cold it stole the breath from his lungs and nearly swept his horse from its feet. The trail grew steeper, disappearing into treacherous rock slides and narrow ledges with 1,000-foot drops. Days blurred into a grueling cycle of survival. The sun was an anvil in the sky, beating down on him without mercy. The nights were a shroud of ice, the temperature plummeting as soon as the sun vanished, the cold seeping deep into his bones. He fell from his horse on a slick patch of shale, his bad leg twisting under him, sending a bolt of white-hot agony through his body. He lay there for an hour, teeth gritted against the pain, before forcing himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. His supplies dwindled. He hunted squirrels and rabbits for food, his hunger a constant, gnawing ache in his belly. Through it all, he was driven by a single, unwavering vision. June, her face, her quiet strength, the memory of her kindness. He thought of his children, Samuel and Sarah, living in that harsh wilderness, and it fueled his resolve. This brutal journey was a penance. It was a payment for his years of ignorance, for the pain his actions and inactions had caused. He would endure it. He would find them. One evening, exhausted and half-starved, he collapsed by a small, sputtering fire. He was bruised, battered, and his leg was a constant throb of pain. He felt a moment of despair, a fear that this wilderness would claim him, that he would die here, another nameless skeleton in these God-forsaken mountains. But then he looked up, and through a break in the trees, he saw it, a peculiar rock formation, shaped like a hawk's head. The landmark the old trapper had told him to look for, and beyond it, rising into the deep purple of the twilight sky, he saw a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke. Hope, fierce and powerful, surged through him. He got to his feet, every muscle screaming, and began to walk, his limp a testament to the journey he had endured. He was close. The end of his quest, and the beginning of his life, was just through the trees. The smoke was his North Star. He followed it through a final stand of gnarled, wind-stunted pines, his heart a frantic, hopeful drum against his ribs. The trees thinned, and he stepped into a small, hidden meadow, a secret of green cupped in the granite hands of the mountains. And there it was, a small cabin, built of rough-hewn logs, with a roof of packed earth from which tiny wildflowers grew. It was nestled against a sheer rock face, as if seeking its protection. It was a place of profound, almost sacred silence. A woman was outside, hanging small pieces of clothing on a line strung between two trees. Her back was to him, but he knew her instantly. The line of her shoulders, the dark hair pinned up at her neck, the quiet efficiency of her movements. It was June. A small boy was at her feet, trying to build a tower of stones, while a little girl chased a butterfly through the tall grass. Samuel and Sarah, his children. The sight was so simple, so painfully beautiful. It stole the breath from his lungs. This was the family he never knew he had, living a secret life in the heart of the wilderness. He took a step forward, and a dried twig snapped under his boot. The sound was like a gunshot in the still air. June froze, then spun around, her eyes wide with animal alarm. She saw him, a ragged, bearded figure standing at the edge of the trees, and for a long moment, she simply stared, her face a mask of utter disbelief. She looked at him as if he were a ghost, a hallucination conjured from loneliness and mountain mist. "Eli," she whispered, the name a fragile breath of air. The children, sensing their mother's fear, scrambled to hide behind her skirts, peering out at the strange man with wide, uncertain eyes. He started walking toward her, his limp pronounced, each step an agony and an act of worship. He saw the disbelief in her eyes shift to fear. She thought he had come in anger, that he had come to condemn her. He saw her brace herself for the blow. When he was finally standing before her, he didn't speak, he just drank in the sight of her, memorizing the new lines of worry around her eyes, the strength in her hands, the impossible, beautiful reality of her. He raised a trembling hand and gently touched her cheek. She was real. "June," he said, his voice raw and broken from his journey. She flinched at his touch, tears welling in her eyes. "Eli, I can explain." He shook his head, cutting her off. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a desperation that spoke of deserts crossed and mountains climbed. He held her so tightly he could feel the frantic beat of her heart, a captive bird against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, the familiar scent of wood smoke and pine a balm to his shattered soul. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his hands framing her face. He asked her the question that had driven him across the wilderness, the question that was the key to everything. "Why?" he choked out. "Why would you ever think I wouldn't want you, that I wouldn't want our children?" The question wasn't an accusation. It was the cry of a heart that had been broken not by her actions, but by her silence, and it shattered the last of her defenses. A great shuddering sob escaped her, and the whole story, the whole painful, tangled truth, came pouring out. They sat on a fallen log as the sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The children, sensing the storm had passed, played quietly nearby. Through her tears, she told him everything. She spoke of Caroline's cruel ultimatum, the threats that had seemed so real to a young, terrified girl with no one in the world to turn to. She confessed her deepest fear, that the truth of his children's conception, born of his drunken grief, would only bring him more shame. I thought I was protecting you." She wept. A hired girl and a bastard child. That was all the world would see. "I couldn't do that to you. I loved you too much to be the cause of your ruin." She told him of her pride, the stubborn belief that she could do it all on her own, that she could raise their children in a world that would never know their father, rather than risk his rejection. She had created a fortress of silence and solitude, believing it was the only way to keep him safe from the consequences of her love. When she finished, he reached out and wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. Then he told her his story. He told her of Caroline's return, of the discovery of the birthmarks, of the journey to Providence and the name he found in the dusty ledger. He told her of the confrontation, of Caroline's bitter confession, of the rage and the emptiness that had followed. "You weren't protecting me, June," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You were saving a part of me I didn't even know I had. All that time I thought I was alone. A part of me was here, with you. You carried that burden all by yourself. You never should have had to." In the twilight of that hidden valley, surrounded by the silent, watching mountains, they laid all their secrets bare. Every misunderstanding, every fear, every silent, painful choice was brought into the light and cleansed by the raw honesty of their shared tears. That night, in the small, one-room cabin, was a homecoming. The children slept soundly in a small loft, their presence a quiet blessing in the room. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on the rough log walls. They came together not with the desperate, storm-fueled passion of that night in the barn, but with a reverence and tenderness that was a kind of prayer. The air was alive with unspoken words, with the years of pent-up love and sorrow. His hands, rough and calloused from his journey, moved over her with a gentle awe, as if he were touching something sacred. He traced the lines of her face, the curve of her shoulder, committing to memory the woman who had haunted his every waking thought. Every touch was an apology for his blindness. Every caress was a promise to never be blind again. Their shadows, cast by the firelight, danced on the wall, separate at first, then slowly merging, flowing into one another until they were indistinguishable. A single, unified shape. His kiss was not one of taking, but of giving. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of deep and abiding respect for the strength she had shown, for the love she had guarded so fiercely. Her response was one of total surrender, not of weakness, but of trust. She let go of the fear and the pride that had been her armor for so long, and let herself be loved, completely and without reservation. In the warm, firelit darkness, they whispered their truths. He told her of the emptiness she had left, and she told him of the lonely nights she had prayed he might somehow find her. It was a healing, a quiet, sacred ceremony of two souls finding their way back to each other. It was the mending of a bond that had been forged in a moment of drunken grief and secret love, and had been tempered in the fires of separation and hardship. As the embers in the hearth burned low, they lay in each other's arms, their breathing synchronized, their hearts beating a slow, steady rhythm. They were not the same people who had met in a storm. The ghost of a man, hollowed out by betrayal, was gone. The silent, fearful woman, hiding from the world, was gone. In their place were a man and a woman who had journeyed through their own private wildernesses and had found not just each other, but themselves. They had been reborn, not as two broken halves made whole, but as two complete souls, fused together by forgiveness, truth, and a love that had proven strong enough to conquer it all. The journey down from the granite mountains was the opposite of the ascent. The treacherous paths that had been a torment on the way up now seemed like a clear road home. Eli led the horse, with June and a child on its back, and the other child held securely in his own arms. They were a strange, ragged procession, but for the first time in his life, Eli felt a sense of wholeness he had never known. The vast, indifferent wilderness no longer felt like an enemy. It was the crucible that had burned away the lies, leaving only the pure, unbreakable truth of the family he now led out of its heart. Their arrival at the ranch was quiet. The neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a kind, stout woman whose eyes missed little, came out to meet them. Her gaze took in the scene. Eli's battered appearance, the strange yet familiar woman, and the two children who were clearly not the same two she had been watching. But she saw the look on Eli's face, a look of fierce, protective peace, and her questions died on her lips. "Caroline is gone," she said simply. "Left the morning after you did, left a note." She handed him a folded piece of paper. Eli didn't read it. He knew it would be filled with self-pity and blame. He crumpled it in his fist. "Thank you, Martha," he said, his voice full of a gratitude that went beyond her watching the children. "Thank you for everything." The news of their return spread through the territory with the speed of a prairie fire. The initial story was a scandalous one, pieced together from gossip and speculation. Eli Miller, the story went, had cast out his proper wife and taken up with his former hired girl, the same one who had mysteriously appeared months earlier. And the children? They were her bastards, a mark of shame she had brought to his doorstep. The whispers were venomous, the judgment swift and absolute, a master taking advantage of a servant girl. It was an old, ugly story, and the good people of Harmony Creek clucked their tongues and shook their heads in sanctimonious disapproval. Eli knew what they were saying. He could feel it in the air on his first trip into town for supplies. He walked down the dusty main street with June by his side, her head held high but a tremor of fear in her hands, which he held tightly in his own. The townsfolk stopped their conversations to stare. Doors were left ajar, faces peering out from behind curtains. Mr. Hemlock, behind the counter of his store, was suddenly very busy, refusing to meet his eye. Eli would not have it. He would not allow the shadows of lies and shame to touch his family. He stopped in the middle of the street, in front of the general store, and turned to face the silent, judging town. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried with the clear, hard authority of a man who had faced down his own hell and had nothing left to fear. "I know what you're all whispering," he began, his gaze sweeping over the faces that now stared openly at him. "So I'm going to tell you the truth, and I'm only going to say it once." He pulled June a little closer to his side. "This is June Miller. This is my wife." Then he gestured back toward the wagon where Samuel and Sarah sat, their eyes wide. "And those two are Samuel and Sarah Miller. They are my children, my blood." He let the words hang in the still, hot air. He didn't offer any more explanation. He didn't speak of Caroline's deceit or the 5 years of lies. His private pain was not for their entertainment. He gave them only the unshakable, public truth. "This is my family," he finished, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "And any man or woman who has a problem with that, or who shows them anything less than the respect they are owed, will answer to me." He turned his back on them then, helped June into the wagon, and drove out of town, leaving a stunned, simmering silence in his wake. The scandal did not die overnight. For weeks, they were the subject of every hushed conversation, every disapproving glance. But Eli's stand had drawn a line in the dust, and slowly, things began to change. The change came not from his words, but from June's actions. She was a constant, quiet presence of grace and strength. She joined the women's quilting circle at the church, and though she was met with cold shoulders at first, her skill with a needle and her gentle, unassuming nature began to win them over. When old Mrs. Gable's son came down with a lung fever, it was June who sat by his bedside for 2 days straight, applying cool cloths and spooning broth into his mouth, long after the other women had given up. When a flash flood threatened the lower pastures, it was June who was out in the rain alongside the men, helping to herd the terrified cattle to higher ground. People began to see not the scandalous hired girl of the rumors, but the woman herself, resilient, kind, and possessed of a quiet dignity that no amount of gossip could tarnish. They saw the way her children adored her, the way the ranch began to thrive under her touch. They saw the light in Eli's eyes. The return of the man he had been before Caroline had broken him. And slowly, grudgingly at first, then with genuine warmth, the community began to accept them. The whispers faded, replaced by friendly greetings. The scorn was replaced by respect. Life on the ranch was transformed. The oppressive silence that had once filled the cabin was replaced by the sound of children's laughter. The fields, which Eli had once worked with the grim penance of a ghost, he now tended with the hopeful purpose of a man building a future. He bought more cattle, hired a couple of steady hands, and built a new room onto the cabin. The ranch was no longer a place of survival. It was a place of life, a testament to the family that had been forged in secrets and redeemed by truth. The story closes on an evening in late autumn, a year after their return from the mountains. The sky was on fire, the setting sun painting the clouds in brilliant streaks of crimson and gold. June stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around Samuel and Sarah, who stood on either side of her. They were watching the road, a familiar ritual at the end of each day. A figure on horseback appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the spectacular sunset. It was Eli. As he drew closer, they could see he was holding something in his hand. He rode into the yard, swung down from his horse, and walked toward them, a slow, easy smile on his face. In his hand was a bouquet of wild prairie flowers, a splash of purple and yellow against the fading light. He handed the flowers to June, his rough fingers brushing hers. It was a simple gesture, but it held a universe of love and shared history. He kissed her softly, then swung his children up into his arms, one on each hip, their joyous squeals filling the quiet evening air. June watched them, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She watched the man she loved, the father of her children, standing in the yard of the home they had built together out of the ashes of their past. She thought of the storms they had weathered, the mountains they had climbed, both real and imagined. She thought of her flight, of the fear and the loneliness, and of the incredible, improbable journey that had brought her back to this perfect, peaceful moment. She leaned against the porch rail, a soft smile on her lips, and whispered to the vibrant, beautiful twilight, the words a sacred promise to herself and to the family before her. "This time," she said, "I'm not leaving." Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to build our community, so please comment below and let us know where you're listening from. If you enjoyed the tale, please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts on Eli and June's journey.